For the first time in more than 2 years, Rivers State seems to be experiencing genuine peace in the political firmament, owing to the reconciliation of Governor Fubara and his political godfather, predecessor, and now Minister of the Federal Capital Territory, Nyesom Wike. In spite of this, some stakeholders continue to doubt the sincerity underlying that public show of rapprochement, with some saying that what obtains now is just the two men's response to an inevitable political reality check and the need to survive a possible political capitulation for anyone that loses out. President Bola Tinubu has been credited with brokering that peace and now stands to reap massively as a result, given that both the governor and the minister are seen by many to be doing all they can to put at the disposal of the president the best that Rivers State can possibly offer. We're now being joined for a conversation around all of that by Dr. Austin Tam-George, an academic, communications consultant, and one-time Rivers State Commissioner for Information and Communication. We will share the thoughts on the recent defection of Governor Fubara from the People's Democratic Party to the All Progressives Congress and how that may impact the journey to the 2027 general elections. Good morning, Dr. George. Good to have you join us again.
Thank you, Steve.
In the studio here in Lagos. It's always a pleasure to have you around.
Thank you.
Good morning. And compliments of the season.
Same to you, Steve. All
right, let's talk about your state, the state that you love so much. With Governor Fubara's defection to APC, it looks like for the first time since 1999, no single PDP governor is remaining in the Niger Delta, in the South-South. And then more importantly, people were hoping that Rivers State, which is like, Lagos, like Kano, solid economically, huge population, and then, good political character would at least have a semblance of, opposition. But here we have Governor Fubara saying that not only has it decamped to APC, he's totally for President Tinubu, he's assuring 70% of the elections in the kitty already, and that he has always been a progressive at heart. What is your reading of what is going on? Is this the Rivers State that you know, or the political equation has changed?
Governor Fubara has a governance doctrine in Rivers State around the notion of putting the people's interest first. In fact, the governance doctrine is called Rivers First.
Okay.
So my thinking is that what he's doing by moving from the PDP to the APC is to align more perfectly, with the federal authorities to make sure that what is due to the Rivers people comes to them. That's number one. The second point, which he himself made, was that he wanted critical stability for the state. Because Steve, over the past 2 years or so, Governor Fubara had a very turbulent time in government. And so what I think he's done is to say, look, this is not about me. This is about making sure we have stability, because only in the atmosphere of peace and stability can you expect that he is going to be able to deliver on the promise that he made to the Rivers people. Because his understanding, at least in my own interactions with him, his understanding and commitment is that he's got a social contract with the Rivers people. He's taking development to a stratospheric level. What he's trying to do now is to make sure that on a sector-by-sector basis, he brings development to the people. He has said publicly, he's made a commitment that beginning from next year, for instance, he's going to make sure that there is a very strong emphasis on budgetary allocation to education. You can only do these things in an atmosphere of peace and stability. He is also making sure that all the zonal hospitals in Rivers State, including about 124 primary healthcare centers, deliver premium healthcare delivery system for the Rivers people. You can't achieve these things in an atmosphere of turbulence and the rest of them. So what I think he's trying to do is to make sure that in addition to positioning himself as a champion for the renewed hope advocacy of the president, the agenda of the president, he himself benefits from the stability that he needs in order to drive development to the doorstep of the people. So if you look at these calibrations, in Rivers State within the context of development, the governor is actually looking towards, delivering service to the people in the context of peace, cooperation with all stakeholders, especially the members of the State Assembly. Because, Right now, the state assembly members, about 16 or 17 of them, already moved to the APC.
Yes.
So what I imagine that will mean is that they will now more properly align with the governor's vision and make sure that whatever remaining issues that they have, they can resolve these issues within the context of cooperation as members of the same party and align with the governor's vision of putting the people's interests first and deliver service to the people.
And that actually makes sense. We'll get to the issue of the state assembly members in a second, but it does seem that Governor Fubara is battle worn. Like you said, for 2 years he's been dealing with quite turbulent political and personal matters. So, but you've been very vocal about the destabilization of Rivers State. Looking back, was President Tinubu's decision to impose this state of emergency something of a necessary surgical strike in order to prevent anarchy and to recalibrate people's minds, get everything back in order? Or did it set something of a dangerous precedent for the country like we were speaking of before?
Well, my reading, especially of the mood of the Rivers people right now, is that they do not want to look through the rear view mirror. What they think.
But it's important. It's important to analyze what happened so that when you're moving forward, you don't make the same mistakes, and then you learn from your mistakes. I think that's also an issue with us, and we don't look retrospectively at the decisions that are made politically. So a lot lot of these missteps and issues tend to repeat themselves.
You're right.
They're avoidable.
You're right. There is no question as far as what the state lost during the state declaration of the state of emergency. I think there's a fair consensus in Rivers State and frankly around the country that when you declare a state of emergency in a state, only the people there can suffer. Mm-hmm. And Rivers State has had the back foot, when the state of emergency was declared. It meant practically, for instance, that nearly all the development projects had to stop because there was a state of emergency where there was then a disproportionate attention that was fixed on providing security for the state. But, all the projects, that were supposed to be life-changing projects came to a standstill. And Rivers State, as you know, since 1958, has been the oil and gas hub of the country. And when you have a state of emergency, meaning that proper democratic structures were dysfunctional or suspended, what that meant was that business could not also thrive. So whether the president had the right to declare a state of emergency, I think is a moot point. I heard Steve referring to Section 305 of the Constitution that says, I think unequivocally, that the president has the right to declare a state of emergency in order to make sure normality was restored so that administration could begin. But whether he had the right to suspend the democratic structures is a matter I suspect that is going to be debated for decades to come. Mm-hmm. But for the Rivers people, what matters right now is to say, look, how do we move from this setback to make sure that the governor's agenda of putting the people first, is realized. And that is what, is happening now in Rivers State. And I suspect that the governor's pivot, to the APC is going to give him, as I said in the introduction, the kind of stability, the kind of cooperation that he needs. What actually is manifesting on the ground, for those who may not know, is that the governor has a very strong organic support. And I think that it is because he has prioritized the needs of the people. Let me just give you a few examples, which I have, researched and personally confirmed. For the first time since 1967, Rivers State has an unprecedented scale of investment in housing. The governor is building 20,000 houses in the first phase of a massive, imagination for housing scheme in the state. For the first time since 1967, what he's doing is to make sure that middle-income workers have direct access to housing. Just 2 days ago or so, he commissioned the first 1,000 houses in this phase. So what I think is going to do is to make sure that when people have decent accommodation, we saw the example in Singapore, which has the best housing scheme in the world. When you give housing scheme like this, targeting vulnerable members of society, actively working people in society, what you're going to achieve is social mobility. Social mobility means people are going to be able to climb the ladder to prosperity because they don't have to worry about housing. They don't have to worry about all the associated inconveniences that comes with living in slums. So if he's spending involved in social investment. Social investment means expending money, building people's capacities, lifting communities out of poverty. And his penetration point, as I see it, for social investment is housing. 20,000 housing units. Unprecedented, never happened before. So this has actually aligned the people's need with the governor's vision. And so he has a massive organic support. I mentioned what is happening in health, and I mentioned that the zonal hospitals are back on stream. 124 primary healthcare centers are back on stream. For the first time, Rivers State has a contributory healthcare scheme, meaning that people are going to have direct access to health insurance. All these things are impossible to achieve if you don't seek stability. So the pivot, to the APC means he's going to better align with the renewed hope agenda of Mr. President and see that he brings, the promise of democracy to his own people. So I suspect that some people might be saying, this is an opportunistic move. This fellow simply wants to move from
that's
PDP.
what they're saying. Definitely what
they're
saying.
But for those of us who are in Rivers State, we can see the alignment between the governor's activities to what is happening on the ground.
Okay, that's where I was actually coming to, because when you emphasize on peace and stability, a lot of people are wondering, is this peace of the graveyard? Because on the day that the governor declared, and he also had a band like Wike used to, and all the song and dance and everything, when he led the singing and spoke about the second stanza of standing on, Bola Tinubu's mandate. On your mandate, we will stand. He says something about his defection is not, and standing on the mandate is not corner, that is coming out straight. A lot of people were reading that, was that a shade at Nyesom Wike? And then when he now re-emphasized the fact that he's now number one and the leader of the party in APC, does that mean that for Wike to have remained in PDP that is battling for the entire roof not to cave in, is that an advantage to the governor if Wike remains in PDP? And then when you now say that this is all about stability, people say that it is opportunistic, and that why is he unable to stand on his feet for the people of Rivers State and confront whichever monsters, whether in the PDP or in APC, that were after him? After all, when you said, is it not convenient to just basically move to where the president is? His own boss, his own godfather, Wike, stood firmly against Buhari for 8 years. And it wasn't an easy battle because Rotimi Amechi, who was a powerful federal minister, was also on Wike's neck. Why didn't Wike say, for me to be safe and sound and draw Rivers people to the center, let me go and align with Buhari? He didn't do that. So why is Fubara?
Steve, a lot of things you've said. Let's just tease them out individually. The first thing you mentioned about Governor Fubara being the leader of the party of the APC. I don't think in Rivers State. I don't think is out of alignment with what is already the convention or the tradition of the APC. If you check what is happening in Akwa Ibom State, the governor is the leader of the party.
Correct.
If you go to Owerri, Imo State, if you go across the spectrum, in fact, the tradition of the APC is that the leader of the party is the person holding the highest elected office in the state, which happens to be the governor. So when Governor Fubara was talking about being the number one party member of the APC. It is in alignment with already existing tradition of the APC. He didn't invent it.
But shouldn't that go without saying?
No, well, you know, he needed to make the people understand that, look, with my pivot to the APC comes the leadership of the party. And so I think it was his own way of letting the people know that, look, this is a pivot that you should, probably embrace, because I will be leading the party and I'll be pursuing the agenda locally, domestically, in the same way that the president is pursuing the federal agenda at the center. So I think the most important emphasis, Steve, that we should draw is that the governor is looking to align with the agenda of the APC at the federal level. Remember that at the federal level, there is a renewed hope agenda that happens on a sector-by-sector basis. I mentioned the case of housing earlier. There is a renewed hope agenda on housing development across the country at the federal level. So you see that there is a synonymic connection between the governor's own agenda in the state and how he tries to link it with what is happening at the center. The other point has to do with the similarities of the visions. I'm not a politician, so I'm not very interested in how they go about it. But what I think the governor is trying to do is to make sure that, look, if I'm supporting the president's agenda, I should make the case directly to the Rivers people, because he recognizes that in Rivers State, sovereignty lies with the people. And so, look, he feels that, look, if I was elected on the platform of the PDP, it makes sense for me to make the justification, the case for my pivot to the Rivers people who elected me. And I guarantee them that, look, I'm here because I made this pivot, because ultimately it is going to be in the interest of everyone in Rivers State. My own sense, frankly, Steve, is that the governor has made a very important call, because if you want to historicize the political developments in Rivers State since 1967, you'll probably recognize that Rivers State has always had an alignment with the center anyway. Rivers State has always had an alignment with the center, with the federal government. So if you look at it from the MPN days up to this current moment, what Governor Fubara's pivot has meant is not totally radical for the Rivers people, because we've always had this alignment.
What did Rivers lose under the 8 years of Buhari that Wike was in PDP?
Well, I won't speak, for...
You were commissioner at
yes,
that time?
Yes, but right now, as I said, the overall preponderance of sentiment in Rivers State is to make sure we look at the moment and to see what we stand to benefit, from the federal government. Look, I am particularly concerned about how the governor is going to deliver development, frankly speaking, because, Steve, as you know, not just in Nigeria, everywhere else around the world, politicians tend to look for how they can get stability in order to make sure they establish their legacy. For Governor Fubara, the most, at least as far as my own interactions with him are concerned, the consuming passion that he has is, how am I going to be remembered after this moment is past? And that is legacy thinking. His thinking is that, look, I've got this broad agenda. Look at what is happening in urban development. He recognizes that Port Harcourt since 1967 has been congested, and now he's opening the Trans-Calabar Corridor, investing over 250 billion naira to open that entire area to make sure development gravitates towards the people in that area. That cannot happen in an atmosphere of perennial political chaos and the rest of that. So he's looking at the bigger picture. I know some people will insult him for being opportunistic and all that, but if you look at this guy's, the governor's agenda and his obsession to have a very strong legacy, I think you cannot but agree with him. If you have a whole area being developed with over 250 billion naira, there is the port city that's also emerging around the Eleme area, built around the seaport ecosystem. All of these things are very broad, I should say unprecedented, ideas on development. You can't have this kind of development and not align with the source of funding, which is the federal. So a lot of people may look at these things happening within the context of the limited conflict between him and the assembly. But the governor is thinking large scale. He's thinking in terms of what will my legacy be? What will be the impact on the Rivers people if this agenda derails? And so he's extremely protective about his legacy.
Well, he only has a little bit of time left as well. We do acknowledge that there was a lot of time spent fighting, and if he's concerned about his legacy, he only has a couple of years left to do all these projects that he's talked about. And I think that's why a lot of people are like, this seems a little bit more about the legacy of his political future more than the legacy of the state. And a lot of people are asking, where is his backbone? Which I think is a bit of an unfair question to ask. We've seen him fight the opposition tooth and nail for 2 years as the governor of Rivers State, and now he's aligning with his oppressors, so to speak. But obviously, it's the ruling party of the day which can help him get things done. But you yourself, you voluntarily resigned as a commissioner years ago on a matter of principle.
Yeah.
So it still exists, you know, and we still expect it of individuals that are in political spaces. Is there still room
with
for
principle and courage?
Pardon?
I said with principle and courage.
With principle and courage, it's very rare. It's very rare, but it's very strong currency. If you were to advise Governor Fubara today on his remaining roadmap to 2027, you know, connecting to the center, where should he focus? I know you were talking about the housing and expansion of those, but how would he better put his Rivers First grassroots movement to use so that his legacy will be remembered as someone who was able to execute these projects, not someone who was just, you know, slapped around by both parties and at the end, you know, had his...
No, excellent question. And I
question.
think I alluded to that earlier in our conversation when I said the governor himself has projected what his next emphasis will be on a sectoral basis. He said the 2026 budget is going to be disproportionately focusing resources on education. You know, when you look at if you look at the spectrum of development in any society, there has to be an emphasis on education, because it is in education that you begin to build manpower development. And so what he is thinking he will do, he's done it a couple of years already, but now there's going to be a very strong emphasis, not only in terms of budgetary allocation, but in terms of the kind of revolutionary changes he wants to see. For instance, he is very concerned about the specter of people leaving universities or leaving different centers of learning without getting jobs. So what I think he wants to do now from 2026 is to make sure that there is a great deal of emphasis on skill acquisition, so that when people leave universities or any of these places of learning, they'll be able to not only get jobs, that is, be industry ready, they will also be able to create jobs themselves. So he's going to give a lot of emphasis on skill acquisition, meaning that we should expect a great deal of budgetary allocation to technical education and rejuvenation of those kind of centers. Then the other point has to do with understanding that the knowledge economy today revolves around tech. So what he's going to do is to make sure that, you know, there is a great deal of, you know, emphasis on building technical capacity. You know, a lot of people sometimes are so obsessed with certification and credentialism that they forget that technical education is actually the way to go. If you look at the example of Taiwan, a population of just 23 million people, they are the world leaders in the production, manufacturing of semiconductors. Semiconductors are sometimes called microchips. And that is because despite the very challenging topography of Taiwan, in fact, for them to build houses and bridges in Taiwan, they have to import sand and gravel from China. That's how difficult and challenging the topography is. But they recognize this and say, look, our most important resource is not oil and gas or clay. Our important resource has to be the people. So they invested deliberately and massively in technical education. Today, they are leaders in semiconductors. That is the kind of inspiration I think that Governor Fubara is trying to draw. He wants to make sure there is so much emphasis, strategic investment in education going forward, so that in the next 10, 15 years, when all of this politics is done, his major legacy will be to say, look, I was able to transform education in a way that when we are looking at the next pool of leaders, there's going to be a very sophisticated manpower pool from which we can draw to say, you now take this legacy to the next level.
Well, to do all that, it seems like he's going to need a second term. Is that what he's bandying up for?
If Governor Fubara if he's going to get a second term, it's going to depend entirely on the Rivers people.
Or whether he joins APC.
No. What the platform is not important. He's already a member of the APC. What I think is going to make the deal for him is going to deliver on all these points of development on a sector by sector basis, so that at the end of the day during election, all he needs to do is to let the Rivers people to see that, look, this was what I meant.
This is my scorecard.
This is my scorecard. And Rivers people that I know as a Rivers man, they will be able to say, look, our son, if you've done this, despite all of these distractions and problems, we give you a second mandate to go forward and consolidate on your legacy.
Right,
I see that happening.
Okay, Dr. George, just very quickly before we let you go, two quick questions. One is on where you just landed now, scorecard and things like that. There are small talks about the fact that part of the deal that was struck in Abuja was that Governor Fubara won't run for a second term. Now that he's an APC, and now that there's peace and stability in quote, and he has some time to work, do you think that if that is true at all, that might change if performance, and loyalty, performance on one hand and loyalty are both positive? And the second question would be on, you've mentioned the areas that he will deal with it.
Because this is a very fundamental point you've raised. I just want to address it quickly before you move to the next point. No such agreement was reached. I have seen the speculations and propaganda on social media and the rest of them concerning some putative agreement reached. Look, the governor's mandate is to deliver service to the Rivers people. No agreement was reached concerning the political lifespan of the governor's tenure. The governor has a constitutional right to seek a re-election, and it will be up to the Rivers people to choose, whether they are going to give him the mandate. I suspect they are going to give him the mandate.
But will he be interested in running?
That is up to him. I would personally encourage him, because I have seen the trajectory of his performance, and I think he has a strong case to make to the Rivers people. Look, if you've been following events over the past 88 days or so, he's been commissioning legacy project after legacy project. It will be most irresponsible to allow such a legacy to go to waste in the name of some alleged, agreement. My own understanding of the agreement that they had was that there was going to be a consensus to converge around the Rivers First agenda of the governor. And if that takes him to the second term, it will be up to the Rivers people, not anyone else, to decide the political lifespan of the governor. I personally would encourage him, given the trajectory of his performance, given his commitment to take development to the doorstep of the Rivers people, it would be the height of betrayal not to seek a second term to consolidate such a wonderful legacy for our people.
Well, on that note,
fantastic. I mean, I won't ask the second question again because we'll run out of time, but because you have his ears and everything, it is not just about housing. They're good, education, fantastic, but then the soft power that Rivers State, particularly Port Harcourt, as the garden city, used to have. Please tell the governor, at least he has a whole 1 year in 2026 to return a Rivers State to that time. Rivers State that was the book capital of the world when Rotimi Amechi was there. Rivers State that hosted the African Movie Academy Awards when Wike was there. That's
Stephen, I can tell you, because you're running out of time, I can guarantee right here that Rivers State is back and open for business.
Absolutely.
Thank
you so much, Dr. George. I mean, it sounds nice and everything, and we do hope that all these things will turn out well. We wish the governor very well.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.